Hello?
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm doing great. Hold on. Are you able to make your microphone stuff louder? Or?
Is that better?
Yeah. Oh, hey, yeah. Okay. You have the email or whatever?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Sorry, this is the first time I've done something like this, so I apologize if I'm a little nervous.
Yeah, no problem. It's fine. All right, real quick. Just to establish, what is your background?
Sure. So I'm a current senior in philosophy at UC Berkeley. Um, I am graduating in a month and a half, give or take. Uh, I am on track to graduate summa cum laude, so
What does
I
that mean?
think I
Is that
it's
like
highest
top of your
honors.
class or whatever? Okay, okay.
Yeah, so top 4% of my class.
Gotcha. What is like your specialty? Do you have that as an undergrad in philosophy, or is it just a broad
Mm,
general?
yeah, so broadly speaking, you study everything.
Uh-huh.
It's really just sort of personal interest.
Gotcha.
So my personal interest is definitely ethics and political philosophy. I'm really interested in questions that sort of Rawls covers and stuff like that.
Oh, cool.
But
So this is
yeah, I've
kind of up your
definitely.
alley, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit more meta-ethical than I like to get, mostly because I find a lot of these discussions to be um, kind of misguided at the end of the day. But yeah, I agree that uh, yeah, it's definitely up my alley, which is why listening to these people talk about the graph made me a little bit skeptical.
Okay, cool. All right, cool. And then I have no formal background in this whatsoever. I just talk to people like you to get my opinion, so don't do me
Sure,
wrong, okay?
I'll do my
Okay.
best.
All right. So, let me just read this, okay?
Yeah.
I wanted to add my take as a semi-active professional philosopher to the conversation you had last night with AY. Full disclosure, I talked with the two of them frequently, and they initially invited me to come on to discuss last night with you, but I was traveling for work. I don't defend their views of ethics, though I do think one of your criticisms is misguided. I'm going to ignore most of your conversation and focus on one particular issue. The issue in contention is whether the polyaxiomatic ethical system is just utilitarianism. So this is kind of I know that she puts this in quotes, but this is just kind of my first thing. So I tried to search for this. Does anybody use the term polyaxiomatic? Is this like even a real thing? Because I can't find like anything
Yeah.
at all.
I've never heard of anything put like that. The closest thing that I'm aware of that gets to the idea is value pluralism,
Yeah, sure.
um,
But
which is different from monism. Yeah.
yeah, but I don't think when you say, hold on one second, I gotta fucking ban this idiot. When you say value pluralism, that's the values that you're talking about there. That doesn't have to do with utilitarianism and deontology, does it?
Well, it has to do with the fundamental values that both of those principles. So, utilitarianism and deontology refer to ethical frameworks,
Yeah, but they
right?
don't actually have
And
values in and of themselves, right?
well, they're built on values, right? So, utilitarianism is built on values like consequences pertaining to the pleasure and pain experienced by rational agents. Deontology is built on values having to do with the respect that is owed to rational agents outside of consequences. So they do have to do with values, but they go beyond the values
Yeah,
to
I'm
actually
sorry. Let me
say
be. Let me try to
dictate
be like
action.
really clear. When I say
Sure.
they don't necessarily have values. They themselves don't imply values. So, for instance, like if I were to say I am a deontologist, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think murder is wrong. What it means is that if I think murder is wrong, I can interpret it through a deontological framework or a utilitarian framework, right? Like just saying you're a
Correct.
yeah. Okay, that's what I mean. Okay,
Yeah, they
so
don't prescribe particular action just through the word itself. They prescribe formulas that get us to answers about the
gotcha,
action.
gotcha. Okay, cool. So you would have a set of values first, and then you would interpret that through the framework of deontology or consequential or deontology or consequentialism, right?
I mean, that would probably be the wrong way to go. I think most philosophers would say you should have the framework first and then use that framework to arrive at your value system. It's sort of motivated reasoning if you go the other way.
Okay, sure. Okay, yeah, cool. I can understand that. My second part then would be neither of these things are axioms, are they? Or are they utilitarianism or deontology? Would you?
Neither of them are axioms per se. They're built on axioms. So I guess you could boil them down to really sort of brute axioms like pleasure minus pain is the right thing to do, or you should always take the action that is considered to respect agents to the maximal degree. So you can boil down the systems to certain axioms, but you would probably be doing huge injustice to the framework in doing so.
Sure. Well, and then technically you can boil everything down to an axiom by definition, right?
Yeah, yeah, which is why it's problematic.
Okay, gotcha.
Which is why also the graph doesn't seem to make sense for me. Like utilitarianism probably wouldn't look this pretty, depending on what kind of utilitarianism you're talking about.
Mhm.
You're not just talking about well-being minus suffering. You could be talking about total utility, average utility, maximal average utility. There are so many different ways to construe it that by only having one variable on the graph, you open up a lot of questions.
Sure. Okay. Cool. Are you familiar with the term threshold deontology or?
I'm not entirely sure what specifically that's referring to. It seems like it's a modification on classical Kantianism,
Mhm.
wherein you say that an action is right or wrong unless you're having to choose between a conflicting action that also has to do with the um, respect that is owed to a particular agent.
Gotcha.
So
Okay, so this is something that I think I'm familiar with. Okay, so
yeah,
if I cut you off, I'm just trying to talk to make sure I have the right idea before you give
yeah,
me
no
one. So
problem.
that yeah. So I'm not trying to cut you off to be rude. Just tell me if I'm
I don't
right or wrong.
really have yeah, I don't really have thoughts on threshold deontology, and I'm not entirely well versed on it, so I just wanted to sort of put that out there.
Gotcha. Okay, that's fine. So my understanding of this concept that I think I'm familiar with is like a classical challenge to a deontologist might be something like a Nazi comes to your door, knocks on the door, and says, "Are there any Jews hiding in your basement?" Well, the deontologist has an imperative not to lie because honesty is virtuous or whatever. So the
Yeah.
so the deontologist has to tell the truth, which would result in a Jewish person being killed. So I've heard that there are other forms of kind of augmenting deontology so that you can respect other agents in a way where
Right.
telling the truth doesn't mean killing someone, right?
Yes.
So that sounds like what this is kind of getting at when you talk about threshold deontology or whatever. Is that if you're gonna,
Right.
yeah,
It might be more helpful to think of, instead of it being a threshold, rather you're just weighing conflicting obligations that you have.
sure,
So you have an obligation not to lie to the Nazi, but you also have an obligation to the people that are hiding in your house, as they are, like, every party involved is a rational agent. So then you're trying to weigh what obligations you might have to them. And that's why I think it's more helpful to understand these kind of questions through a contractualist framework rather than a strictly classical Kantian framework.
gotcha.
But that's just my own opinion.
It is clearly okay. So then, continuing on the email, it is clearly not utilitarianism simpliciter. Is that just a
Yes.
fancy way of saying simply? Yeah,
Brute
okay,
utilitarianism,
okay,
yeah.
gotcha.
Classical million.
Note that anything about say that utilitarianism should generalize consequentialism. I take the following sentence to be an accurate description of. Okay. So.
Can I just skip to the end here? I think broadly speaking, the email is correct, but it doesn't matter. So,
This is something that I don't understand. So this is what I have to understand, or what I don't get is
sure.
So I'm gonna ignore the fact that it really bothers me that like phrases are being used here that I can't find anywhere on the internet. It's like polyaxiomatic ethics. This is a phrase that I can't find anywhere in anything. Like no one has any writing on this whatsoever. But
for the purposes of the discussion, you can just understand that as referring to the graph.
okay, sure, yeah. I guess it just bothers me that if two people with no background have created like a new framework for philosophy, it rubs me the wrong way in a lot of different ways, right?
It's not a new framework. They're trying to take some weird spin-off of value pluralism, but without engaging with any of the problems of pluralism.
Gotcha. Or maybe threshold deontology as well, maybe?
So I'm not entirely sure. So it looks like threshold deontology is being used here as a synonym, but I'm not sure how it's a synonym, because deontology, the reason why it's permissible under some interpretations of deontology to lie to the Nazi at the door does not have to do per se with consequences. It has to do with obligations. So I'm not even sure how you would put deontology as a threshold concept into the terms that they're trying to use in the graph.
Okay, so my problem then with the thing that these people with this email is, so if I skip down to like this statement is pretty clearly anti-utilitarian because it allows for the following true ethical statements. X is obligatory even though it occurs negative 50 units of utility. X is not obligatory even though it creates 500 units of utility. How can you take a deontological obligation and measure it in terms of utility without it being utilitarianism?
You can't. So, yeah, that's the biggest problem that I had with the graph. I'm trying to find a good way to put this. So they tried to get around this problem by saying, well, just replace deontology with whatever D could be, like the inherent moral worth of an action. But that phrase, moral worth of an action, becomes meaningless insofar as you throw deontology out the window. So insofar as deontology, or at least most forms of deontology, would say that the obligation that you have to perform or not perform a specific action is binary, not a gradient. So you either can or can't perform it. It's not case by case, can you perform it? Then you can't really quantify whether something is more deontological or less deontological. The way that you could try to make that work is by saying, instead of deontology, you make it contractualism. Do you know what I mean when I say contractualism?
No.
Okay, so contractualism can be thought of as almost a spin-off off of the traditional Kantian view. Basically, the idea is we owe things to other people, and that's where morality is grounded in. So if I make a promise to somebody, then that obligation to keep the promise might outweigh my desire to just stay home. So it's not utilitarian, right? It doesn't matter what brings you the most pleasure. It matters what
the contracts
obligations
that have been, or obligations. Okay, sure.
Yeah. Now, importantly, and this is why it sort of ties into deontology, even if you haven't explicitly made a promise to people, you have obligations to other people in virtue of them being human and part of like your social group, right? So I might not have explicitly promised not to kill you, but I'm not justified in killing you. I have that obligation sort of de facto, right?
Is this like kind of approaching like a categorical norm or something, or imperative?
Sort of. The main deviation between contractualism and deontology is that you can weigh those obligations to decide what actions you ultimately take. So the main reason why this is considered better than deontology, in my view, is that it allows you to weigh obligations that you have to people that you care about more than strangers. So it's better to keep a promise to my mother than it is to keep a promise to a random stranger because of the obligations I have to my mother, right?
Gotcha. Could a deontologist argue that you have stronger obligations or whatever to people that you know versus strangers, or no?
Kant doesn't really have the tools to do that, in my view. Insofar as they're all reasonable agents in this setting, then it doesn't matter, right? Because you have obligations equally. People, this is the fundamental problem with mapping deontology to utilitarianism like the graph does, is because deontology fundamentally assumes that you cannot interchange people. You can't say, I'm going to help X person at the expense of Y person because, hey, they're interchangeable, right? Pleasure is pleasure, pain is pain. That's not okay. Contractualism says there are meaningful differences between people that allows that changes the nature of our obligations to them. So the reason why I bring up contractualism is because that's one way that you could potentially order the obligations that you have to other people such that you can maybe make some kind of gradient. I don't know how you would put numbers on that, but it certainly would make a lot more sense than deontology, which just says you have an obligation, period, and it's not a more or less obligation.
Gotcha. And then just so I made the statement, but I don't actually know. All right, I shouldn't have made the statement. In deontology, is one action more wrong than another, or do you just have binary rights and wrongs? Like, say, like murdering one person versus murdering two people.
Yeah. My understanding is that, and again, I could be wrong, I'm not a Kantian philosopher, but my understanding is that it's a binary state. So the reason why the deontologist says in the trolley problem, don't touch the lever, is because you cannot engage in a system that's going to be using another as a means to an end. So even though you could save one person as opposed to saving five, and so you could argue through your inaction you're killing the five, the deontologist says, no, you're refusing to engage with that system, and that's the morally right thing to do because it is wrong to pull the lever in either direction.
Okay, wait, and then I think I missed the very beginning of that. So would you say then that they're just binary rights and wrongs? Wasn't it more wrong or more right than another wrong or right?
My understanding would say yes. Yes.
Okay, gotcha. So then just entangling, I guess I'm kind of confused because you said you broadly agree with the email, but it seems like we both agree that we disagree that deontological obligations can be measured in units of utility, right? We agree that that's probably not true?
Correct. The reason why I agree, broadly speaking, is because I'm charitably understanding the email says, if insofar as you have some framework that gives actions some kind of inherent moral worth, then that framework will lead you to a different conclusion than
one. Yeah, okay. So this is my question, okay? Is that if you have quote unquote inherent moral worth, but then you ascribe that inherent moral worth some utility so that you can measure it against other utility, I don't know. I guess I'm just not understanding how that's not just utilitarianism. Does it what I just say make sense?
I think so. So the main thing that confused me about the email
Mm-hmm.
is it seems to me that there's a confusion in terms because what they're trying to do is say that there is a different framework that so okay. Actually, maybe I can just answer your question more directly. So utilitarianism cares only about pleasure and pain,
Sure.
right? That's the primary thing that's driving us.
Sure.
Here, they're using utility in a seemingly different term,
Yeah,
where
actually, well,
yes,
actually,
there's
let's do this real quick because I might be wrong here then. So I'm not
sure,
aware that I thought that utilitarianism measures utility, where
yeah,
utility can be more broadly defined than just pleasure and pain. Is that not true?
yes, it can. So that gets at the distinction between like the very traditional utilitarian coming out of like Bentham
Mm-hmm.
and the more modern form of utilitarianism that comes out of Mill. Mill says it's not about pleasure and pain so much as it is about happiness.
Yeah, sure, okay.
And
Where then even
happiness is a more
happiness,
complex
yeah,
concept.
can be very broadly. So like maybe you're happy, not maximizing. Like maybe a soldier jumping in front of a grenade might find happiness in that or whatever, even if it doesn't maximize or something like that, right? That happiness doesn't necessarily map onto strict pleasure and pain or something.
Well, sort of. So Mill defines happiness as sort of being defined by higher and lower pleasures. Lower
Okay.
pleasures being more in the vein of like the Bentham pleasures, food, sex, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Higher pleasures being more like intellectual stimulation, uh, being able to sort of find fulfillment in other areas of your life. So it's just a more complex form of pleasure, I suppose you could say.
Sure, sure. Or how about like as
But
a better example, somebody becoming a priest and foregoing sexual activity? Like even though
yes,
having lots of sex might
exactly.
be seen as pleasurable, yeah, the higher fulfillment or whatever. Okay,
Yeah. Mill's totally on board with discounting lower pleasures in exchange for higher pleasures. But
gotcha.
here, it seems like they're not using utility in either of those senses. They mean utility, and this is the problem with the graph and with moral pluralism more broadly, right? Um, the the bigger problem here is that they assume that there is at some point a place where the value of the what they're defining as deontology
Mm-hmm.
is exceeded by the value of consequentialism.
Yeah,
That bright line appeals to a third framework that is yet undefined that says at this point it is now worth it to take the action or not take the action.
gotcha.
So, insofar as they do that, the utility that the email is referencing seems to be talking about utility on that third framework that is able to say, look, that utility isn't the same as utilitarian utility insofar as it's going to be taking you in a different direction. So, maybe it's easier to talk in terms of variables.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we're calling the variable that the graph is going to spit out as like the value of an action alpha,
Mm-hmm.
and the utility that a strict utilitarianism would ascribe to the action beta, beta is not going to be the same as alpha, right? Because they're using something else to modify alpha, another framework.
Gotcha. But
And
it seems
that's
like in
what the
order
email
to
is
get
saying.
to in order to arrive at alpha, you have to whatever you're looking at deontologically has to be put into the terms of beta, which seems impossible to me. That's what I don't understand.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
how could you ask like Kant, like, listen, you say we have obligations not to murder one person. Well, let's say that I do murder a person. What utility would you assign that? It would just be like
Right.
that's why I feel that's why when I was talking to them, I was like, wouldn't you just assign these values as positive infinity and negative infinity? Like it's either completely right or wholly
Correct.
wrong. Yeah.
So what the email is saying, and the reason I say I broadly agree with it, is because alpha is not the same as beta. That's what the email is ultimately saying. And I agree, alpha is not beta, because you're saying that there is some new variable in here somewhere that's modifying alpha to make it such that the value of an action is different from the strict utility of an action as understood in utilitarian terms. But insofar as they're different, it's like saying, well, let's celebrate. I put out the fire in my kitchen, but the building is still on fire. Like there's still the broader underlying problem here, which is that you're using a graph, you're using one plane of mapping value onto two different frameworks that are functionally incompatible. So it doesn't make sense to say that alpha is a term of deontology plus utilitarianism. That doesn't make sense, right? And I think that's the more fundamental issue. It's not a question of whether or not the graph is just utilitarianism, because it's not, right? The question is whether or not the graph is even anything, and if it is something, what that something is, because it's certainly not something that I'm familiar with.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So
Cool.
yeah, broadly speaking, the PhD is right to point out that your specific criticism isn't quite right, but the broader criticism that I think what you were making is still holding, which is that it's weird to put deontology into the graph for a number of different reasons.
Sure. So then to rephrase what you're saying to make sure that I understand it. So
Yes.
technically it is not utilitarianism because there is something in this graph which is strictly not utilitarianist. I was interpreting it as such, but they are claiming that it's not. So technically, I would be incorrect if it's not something that is strictly measuring utility. But the problem is they haven't provided a framework that justifies analysis or that provides you anything to analyze. Is that kind of
Correct.
right? Okay?
Yeah. So what's confusing you is that they are trying to put everything in the terms of utility and welfare, which makes you think immediately consequentialism, immediately think utilitarianism.
Sure.
But they're putting it in a
if
term that's broader than that.
Sure. So if I am being uncharitable, and they
Yes.
are, so let's say for instance, I do have a person that says, here's deontological actions. I'm assigning them. Oh, hold on, wait. I might have just totally understood it. Maybe not. Okay. So if you have utilitarianist actions and you've got utility, and then you've got
Yes.
deontological actions and you're assigning them some utility, the actual
Yeah.
moral system you're talking about is whatever system you're using to assign that utility to the deontological action.
Correct.
That,
So
okay,
there would
so
have
that's the thing that needs to be defined.
that needs to be flushed out.
Okay.
In this is called the superscale argument in value pluralism. It's the idea that when you have conflicting values,
Ultimately reducible to some.
well, not reducible, there's some tiebreaker system, some way of ordering the values such that you're not just paralyzed, right?
Yeah.
Because the graph as it is right now, even if we're being super charitable and saying, all right, yes, you can give deontology some kind of value, right? You're still paralyzed insofar as the obligations seem to conflict. So you need to have some kind of tiebreaker framework that says, all right, look, you have values X, Y, and Z. The correct way to think about X, Y, and Z is this way.
Okay, so
right? That allows you to take an action.
Why would you ever be a value pluralist? Why not just say I'm a superscale person, whatever that superscale is, and then take on that moral system?
Well, a superscale is a way of making value pluralism plausible. Because the problem with value pluralism is, okay, you have all these different values. How do you like make them compatible? How do you actually turn those values into an action, right? Because the benefit of having a monist style of values is because you can then build a framework around that value, right? With Rawls, he tries to sort of marry consequentialism and rights ethics into one thing, but ultimately the value he's going for is fairness, right? When you have multiple values that seem to conflict, the question is, how do you make that work? And there are a couple of different answers. One is what philosophers kind of vaguely refer to as pluralist wisdom, which is basically just some kind of faculty of judgment that allows
like,
us to
kind of like
pick and
intuition
choose.
or
Yeah, it's sort of intuition, but it's unclear what that faculty would look like. It's unclear if we should trust that faculty. There are a lot of dubious things about pluralist wisdom. So I would say, broadly speaking, it's not the route that most people want to take. The route that most people want to take is superscales, where they'll say, all right, well, God knows the answer, or there's some greater principle at underlying both of these values that allows us to determine which one is right in which case. I haven't found those arguments convincing. I myself am not really a value pluralist, but I do think, broadly speaking, those are the ways that you make value pluralism work.
Gotcha. Okay. The insulting way I've heard this referenced before is you have like a moral toolbox where you just kind of like take out whatever is the most convenient at the time to solve a problem.
Yeah.
But then it seems like you're always appealing to some form of intuitionism or something at the end of the day, and that none of the value systems actually matter.
Right. I'm not denying that intuitions can be helpful in a lot of these cases. They certainly can be. But I think, broadly speaking, it's right to say that there needs to be ultimately a framework that you arrive at, and it's very hard to make a framework out of value pluralism, at least not one that doesn't have a bunch of problems with it.
Sure, or one that's consistent that multiple people can agree on or whatever, right?
Correct.
Okay, so then my primary challenge then to this system, whatever you call it, my primary challenge would be I want you to tell me by how do you measure like what let's see, it would be how do you assign a value to your deontological actions, because that's actually the super value that you're really getting at that hasn't been defined. Something like that.
Right. So you want to be careful because asking how do you assign the value,
Mm-hmm.
they could misinterpret that as an epistemological worry, where you just say, ah, well, that seems like really hard. How do we have the knowledge to be able to do that? But you want to make it clear that what you're getting at ultimately is, what is the scale by which you are using both by which you are measuring both utilitarianism and deontology. Because if it's just straight utility, then it's unclear how you could assign utility to deontology without just making it a consequentialist system.
Sure. Yeah, and if it okay, so that was, I guess that was kind of like my trip up, because they have that x-axis, which is well-being, which sounds like utility, right? It was like well-being minus suffering. So that's why I just interpreted it ultimately as, it just seemed like utilitarianism to me. If that, maybe that's an uncharitable reading, but if you found a way to map utility onto every deontological action, and then you compare that with standard utilitarian acts, it's just all utilitarianism at the end of the day.
Right. I don't know if that's the strongest objection to go for, because it seems like a charitable reading would make it such that it isn't just utilitarianism. There is something else at play. I think the broader worry, and I think this is why the PhD sort of wisely said, hey, I'm not endorsing the overall scheme. I'm just endorsing this one particular line of attack.
Mm-hmm.
The broader problem is that by mapping those two on there without a broader framework, you're undermining both. So when I say, you can sort of put it in different premises, right? When I say that an action has moral worth or value, I am appealing to some kind of ethical framework that justifies why I can give it that framework.
Gotcha. And that ethical framework is so far undefined, right?
Well, no. The frameworks at play here are deontology and utilitarianism.
Well, but there has to be some super framework that allows you to intermingle these two different, right? And that's what I'm saying is undefined so far, right?
Correct. But the broader problem, too, is that by saying, well, deontology is overruled by utilitarianism in these cases, you undermine both utilitarianism and deontology. So the original reason for ascribing value to an action is undermined by saying that the value is no longer given at a certain level. So I'm trying to put this in a way that makes sense. The reason why deontology ascribes value to particular sets of actions is a certain set of reasons and assumptions about morality, where morality is grounded, right? So when you then say, but morality is actually grounded in something different in these cases, namely consequences, then you undermine the original reasoning for why deontology ascribed value in the first place. So it becomes nonsensical to use deontology to ascribe value in that first place. So you undermine the original theory that you're trying to put into your system.
Gotcha. Okay.
And don't let them do that thing where they say, well, then let's just drop the deontology to get rid of the baggage.
Because that's like the whole fucking thing.
Right, because then the question is, all right, then what is the value, or what is the framework that is ascribing value to an action? Because you can't just say, this action has value independent of any moral framework, because then it's like, what does that even mean exactly?
Okay. Okay, cool. All right. Do you have any final closing thoughts for us or anything?
No, I mean, I will say this.
Mm-hmm.
What they're trying to do isn't crazy on the face of it. I think it is definitely a natural thought that we have obligations that can conflict, and we sort of weigh those obligations naturally. I think a lot of frameworks do that, right?
Yeah.
Where you're trying to figure out, all right, this framework is telling me I have obligations to do X and to do Y. Do I do X or do I do Y?
Yeah.
Right? It's normal to try and find a way to reconcile those views. The problem is that they're trying to reconcile obligations from across different ethical frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to do that, then you need some way of saying, all right, this one is more important than this one under a greater framework. Or if they're not going to appeal to a greater framework, then they have to have some way of making the views compatible such that the actions can be said to have a certain moral value. And it helps to sort of think of it in terms of permissibility. When does an action become permissible?
Mm-hmm.
Because the graph has a line where it says when it becomes good for welfare, but it never tells you exactly when that action becomes permissible, right? Is it anytime it's in the positive of welfare? Is it further
Well,
than
I
that?
think it's whatever the highest point of the graph is like the most permissible act or whatever for any particular act, I'm guessing.
Right. What do you mean by most permissible?
So,
Because
like, if we were to look at murdering some person
yeah.
or whatever, oh no, you're right. I understand what you're saying. You're saying
So
that like
permissibility is a binary state.
yeah, I understand, and that graph
So
does it. But that's even I don't even know if we're at that point yet. But I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
right. But so this is just to say, even if you can get past everything that we've talked about so far, there remains a question of when does the graph tell you that an action becomes permissible? Is it just when it's a positive y value?
Yeah, this is another thing actually that I was thinking in my head. The it's most permissible, or the most permissible act is the one that provides the most amount of utility at any given point in time. That's another reason why I thought it was utilitarianism, because that's what it seemed like. That whatever act was permissible or the best course of action at any point in time was the one that provided the most of that well-being, which sounded like consequentialism to me. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I could see why that. So it's difficult because they're using terms. The email is a huge wrench in all of this because, again, given that you can't really ascribe utility to deontology or to other frameworks that don't recognize consequences as the main reasons for an action being permissible or not, you have to understand them as using utility as something different, right? So it's unclear to me what they're ultimately saying insofar as their terms seem to be kind of screwy, right? So yeah, I see where the confusion is, and I'm not entirely sure. I don't want to speak on their behalf on what they're meaning, but as it stands, I would say that they need to have a couple of answers to the worries that you brought up.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably pretty much everything. I recognize their, I guess like the broader problem. Are you familiar with like Sam Harris or whatever?
I think I've heard his name dropped a couple times, but I don't really know much about him.
Gotcha. I guess like I understand like a lot of the desires. I guess it just bothers me when it feels like people are taking shortcuts to get there. So like utilitarianism and deontology, I imagine to every human on the planet, both have parts that are inarguably desirable, right? Like,
yeah.
I want to be able to kill one person to save 1 million people. I never want to have to say that I can't do that, right? That obviously sounds insane to not say that. But I also want to say that murdering one person is wrong, that's wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, so like, yeah, it feels like we intuitively want to ascribe, right, like categorical imperatives or whatever to actions, that we want to be able to say certain actions right or wrong and not just look at it strictly in terms of outcomes. But sometimes we do want to just look at outcomes, right? So it's like really hard, yeah. So I mean, like I wouldn't say I admire, but I understand that struggle. I guess it just bothers me when people are like, oh well, look, I solved it, and it's like, okay, well, this doesn't really solve anything. You're introducing even more problems, and it seems like you're kind of shortchanging that, yeah.
Yeah, I would broadly speaking agree, and I don't know. Maybe if they wanted to plug in a different theory other than deontology, the graph would make a little bit more sense. But then there are just worries about, well, I guess it would really suck if killing you is below the x-axis here and it's just determined that, well, you have, or above the x-axis, I suppose, because that still leads into the same intuitions that it's wrong to do those things. So I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, speaking. Hey, yeah, I appreciate the conversation, buddy. Maybe I'll poke you again in the future, all right?
Yeah, sure thing. Happy to help. Sorry if anything I said was wrong, but I think broadly speaking, you're on the right track.
Okay, cool. I appreciate it, buddy. See you.
Yeah, bye.